I've been talking about Plato and Aquinas, stroke Aristotle, about Descartes and Kant and David Hume, and it's been pretty obvious, I think, that none of them were materialists. That most of them were convinced that, in some sense, mind or consciousness or intelligence is the primary reality from which all material things flow. And even those who seemed to be opposed to religion, like David Hume, were certainly not materialists, and Hume thought that the ultimate realities were probably impressions, sense data, sensory impulses or sensations, but they were not material things. So materialism is quite, in a serious form, a new arrival on the scene. In fact, I was present when materialism arrived in Oxford. That was in the I can't remember when now, 50s, I think. And there were some seminars held there by Gilbert Ryle. Now, Gilbert Ryle wrote a book called The Concept of Mind, which I'm sure many of you will know, but it was certainly not a materialist work. He was opposed to dualism, to the view that the mind is quite distinct from the body, but he didn't like materialism. He didn't like the thought that the mind was reducible to something material. So it was quite an interesting position, which you could crudely characterize as behaviorist, though he always denied being a behaviorist. Anyway, he held these seminars, and I remember a young, thrusting philosopher called David Armstrong from Australia, who was later to write a materialist theory of mind, turning up at one of these seminars and saying that actually consciousness was based on the material brain and was virtually identical, or was in some sense identical with the material brain. And there was such a sense of shock that it could hardly be believed. Neither Ryle nor A.J. Ayer, who was another professor of philosophy at the time in Oxford, could take that view seriously. So that was in the 1950s. They didn't take materialism seriously. Things have changed quite a lot, and Daniel Dennett, who was a pupil of Gilbert Ryle, has said in his book called Consciousness Explained, subtitled, of course, Consciousness Explained Away, Daniel Dennett holds that almost all philosophers these days are materialists. Well, of course, that is absurdly false, and very few philosophers are materialists. There are some very well-known ones, but that's different. And just think of how many different sorts of philosophers there are in Britain and in America alone. There are idealists. They often go by the name of personalists or process philosophers, but people who think that mind or consciousness is a fundamental constituent of reality. Most philosophy departments in America have at least one of them, a token idealist. There are phenomenologists. They are very common in continental Europe, and Pope John Paul II was one of them. And they think, a bit like David Hume, but not very much like David Hume, that the basis of reality are phenomena in some sense, things experienced, things as they appear to us. There are positivists. I don't know if there are any left, but there probably are, hidden away somewhere. And positivists think that all proper knowledge has to be knowledge of positive facts. And again, they're rather like sense data, but in a much more ruthless way, the emotions and feelings aren't taken so seriously. You've got pragmatists who think that the ultimate test of truth is whether the things that you think work. Peter Strawson in Oxford was a sort of pragmatist, and of course William James is probably the best known here, I should think. There are skeptics, sometimes called postmodernists, who would say that there is no real basis for knowledge at all. It's all a matter of what is current in your society. In fact, I think Richard Rorty manages to be both a postmodernist, pragmatist and a materialist at the same time, so that's quite clever. There are critical realists in the tradition of John Locke. They say that reality as it appears is different from reality as it is, but there is a reality as it is, and for Locke it consisted of material particles with mass, position and velocity, but also of minds. That was Locke's idea of critical realism. So I'm just saying what a broad spectrum of philosophies there are, and materialism is, as I say, quite a recent and very much a minority view in philosophy. Materialism, well, how to define it is rather difficult, and some people prefer the word naturalism. But materialism, I suppose, classically is the view that anything that exists has to exist as a physical thing in space and time. Let's start by defining it that way anyway. The materialism says nothing exists except things that have position and location in space and time. Well, there are some materialists, but of course the trouble with materialism is that it seems to be contradicted by the one thing that it uses as its main evidence, and that is science. There was a time when science might have seemed to support materialism, though interestingly scientists of that sort, like Isaac Newton, were definitely not materialists. Very few of them were. But you can see how people might have thought that science was establishing that the world consisted of solid material particles with specific location in space and time. And as you know, Isaac Newton thought that there was an absolute space and an absolute time, and these material particles were put into it. Of course, Newton thought there were minds as well, so he was no materialist. But if you could somehow explain consciousness or mind as a byproduct or an aspect of material processes, well, you could see how materialism might get going. But things in the 20th century changed science out of all recognition. And of course, the change began, I suppose, in 1911. And in 1911, Rutherford in Cambridge bombarded atoms with alpha particles and discovered that atoms were not small, indivisible lumps of matter, that they were largely empty space, as a matter of fact. And what was inside an atom was deeply mysterious. They were called electrons by J.J. Thomson, but it was not very clear what electrons were, and they're certainly not smaller solid particles than atoms are. That was 1911. In exactly 1924, de Broglie, that's B-R-O-G-L-I-E, de Broglie showed that fundamental particles inside the atom could be considered as waves as well as particles. And so you got the wave-particle duality, according to which if you ask what an electron is, then you may have to say, well, when you're not looking at it, it's a probability wave in Hilbert space, and you can't assign it a specific location or velocity at the same time, and probably not at all. So it's not like a particle at all until you observe it when it becomes a particle. So that's getting a lot more mysterious, really. You begin to wonder, well, what is this stuff, matter? Matter, of course, according to the one equation that everybody knows, E equals mc squared, matter and energy are convertible. Matter is one form of energy. So it's becoming a more mysterious concept. And then in 1925, quantum mechanics was formulated. And it was quantum mechanics which really destroyed the classical materialist view of the world. Because it became apparent, and it's now very apparent, that nobody who knows anything at all about physics can possibly say everything that exists must exist at a precise location in space. It's obvious nobody can say that, because space and time themselves have become objects of physical inquiry and are accounted for in terms of something which is not in space and time. Now, quantum mechanics is reasonably difficult, and I can't really claim to make it clear. I'm encouraged in that thought by the statement that anybody who can make it clear doesn't know what they're talking about. But there are a few things you can say about the quantum world. And one of those is that on the most obvious interpretation, the most widely held interpretation, called the Copenhagen interpretation, after the Copenhagen laboratories where Niels Bohr helped to formulate quantum theory, and that was the most advanced physics laboratory in the world in the 1920s and 30s. And the Copenhagen interpretation is that actually the world is not a deterministic, clockwork sort of universe in which you can state laws according to which everything that happens must happen, and everything is in principle predictable from, as Laplace put it, the first state of the universe and the knowledge of all the laws of nature. Because on the Copenhagen interpretation, nature is fundamentally indeterministic. Now, I don't want to pretend this is uncontroversial. It's not. Einstein never accepted this interpretation, and David Bohm here in London never accepted it. There are people who don't accept it. All I can say is, well, I can say two things about that. First of all, the vast majority of quantum physicists accept this interpretation, and secondly, even those who don't accept it think it's possible. Now, that's actually quite significant, because if it's even possible, that means that physicists do not believe that a deterministic, closed causal system is necessary to the success of physics. In other words, physics doesn't have to postulate a deterministic system. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant thought physics did have to do that. But from quantum theory, it becomes obvious that you don't have to do that. You can have a probabilistic or a stochastic system which assigns probabilities. So what happens in quantum physics is that you take the square of the amplitude of a probability wave, and you say that gives you the probability of finding an electron if you conduct the proper sort of experiment at a particular location. So what you get is a probability. The Schrödinger equations are themselves quite deterministic, so things happen in a sense deterministically, but in detail they are not deterministic. That is to say, a particular electron cannot be predicted as to where it will land up. You can only say there's a probability that it'll be at place X, there's a lower probability it'll be at place Y, but all you can do is assign the probability. You can assign the probability deterministically, right? So there is necessity as well as probability. In other words, it's not all completely random. It's not just all completely chance. I think an example I sometimes use here is the example of people setting off on a journey from the South Pole, and you say to them, you can go in any direction as long as you go north. You have to go north, but of course you can go in lots of different directions, and so they do. But I can also say to them, I can tell you exactly where, if you go far enough, you will end up. You will all end up at the same place, namely the North Pole. So we know that they're all going to be going north, and we know they're all going to land up at the same place. We do not know what they're going to do for most of their lives, right? They may spend some time in South America, or some of them may go to China. So, and that's the way that quantum mechanics can actually deterministically show what things will be like after a few microseconds, as a matter of fact. But it does not determine what is happening to subatomic particles in the interval. In fact, it's rather worse than that, because in the intervals, subatomic particles are not behaving like proper things at all. They are turning into superposed probability waves, right? There is nowhere that they actually are. There is a sort of spread out bit where they might be, and that's all you can say. Now, of course, any textbook of quantum mechanics will explain that in more technical detail, but that's what you have to accept, that the way the universe is partly necessitarian. It's partly governed by laws which do enable you to say what's going to happen and predict what's going to happen, but also it's partly open, it's partly indeterminate. And the Heisenberg principle of indeterminacy is that you cannot assign both a velocity, a momentum, and a location to a subatomic particle. You cannot do it. And Heisenberg's own interpretation of this, which is part of the Copenhagen interpretation, is that that's not just a limitation on your knowledge, it is actually an objective uncertainty. Namely, what we call a fundamental particle does not have both position and velocity at the same time. Namely, it's not a particle. All right. You can speak of it as a superposition of states in which a particle might be, Or you can speak of it as a wave. You see, if you've got a wave, you don't have to think of particles. You think of a sort of spread out thing. It's moving, but it's not particle. But if you speak of a particle, something is going at a specific trajectory. So in quantum mechanics, the fact is you have to think of it both ways for different purposes. And I must stress, because all the quantum physicists I know tell me to stress, that it is not a contradiction. It's not even a paradox in quantum mechanics. There's no great paradox in saying that it's both wave form and particle form. It just means you can't picture it. You can do it mathematically without any contradiction at all, but it means you can't picture what an electron is. And that's just an electron. When you get down to quarks, it gets much worse. Quarks are smaller than electrons, and it's not possible in principle to isolate a quark ever so that you could ever observe it. So modern physics, because they all go in threes and you can't get them apart from each other, so you can talk about groups of quarks, but you can't talk about individual quarks. Well, that's wrong. You can talk about them, but you can't actually ever get them to observe them. So they are as far as you could get from common sense observation of material bits that you could isolate and observe. So you see how mysterious the quantum world is, and it gets much worse. If you read even articles in a fairly popular journal like The New Scientist, you will see that cosmologists now regularly talk of space and time as just 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time, among the 10 or 11 dimensions which constitute our universe. And if you say, well, what are the other dimensions? The answer is, well, they're all rolled up so small that you'll never know. But you have to use them mathematically to get things like string theory or M theory, which are very fashionable theories for physicists to have. The point here is it's all gone a long way beyond observation. Now, has it gone a long way beyond matter? That's a more difficult question. Yes, beyond observation, definitely. Bernard Carr, professor of mathematical physics at Queen Mary College here, has said in physics now what happens is every year our theories get more and more removed from common sense. And that's certainly true, they do. If we live in a curved 11-dimensional space among many other space-times in what's called a brain world, a universe of space-time connected by some membrane to other space-times, well, nobody's ever seen that, and nobody ever could see that either. But this is the stuff of cosmology. So what are we to say about it? Well, I would say these things. First of all, it's obviously not true that old-fashioned materialism can survive in this world, because space-time are only 2 dimensions of a reality which is beyond space-time altogether. If you ask a cosmologist about the origin of this universe, a very frequently given answer is that this space-time originates by quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, which means that there are quantum laws which are not in space-time, and there are fluctuations of particles which come in and out of existence, some of them forming fairly stable universes and some of them not forming universes at all because they can't. But obviously those fluctuations are not happening in space or time. I have asked a physicist friend of mine what is meant by something fluctuating when it's not in time. It's quite hard to think of something fluctuating non-temporally, because as Aristotle said, surely change entails time. So if things fluctuate, they must be in time. But for physicists, these fluctuations can't be in time because time is what is produced by the fluctuations. It's worse than God, really, if you think about it. Well, the point is, though, I mean, when I did ask this physicist friend, he just looked at me and said, just stick to the mathematics, you know, which I couldn't do anyway, so it was a waste of time. So physicists are talking about trans-spatio-temporal realities. They are denying that everything that exists must be in space, because what they're saying is even this space is the consequence of something which is beyond space. So is that matter? Obviously not. What is it? No idea at all. It's a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum. Is that God? Well, probably not, but it's got something in common with God. It's not in space and time, and it brings about the existence of this space-time. It's a bit nearer to God than you might have thought. And it's even nearer than that because, in fact, it has a deep and beautiful and complex mathematical structure. Physicists will not give that thought up, that whatever it is that accounts for the universe, it is elegant, mathematically beautiful. You can do it in mathematics even if you can't imagine it. And that thought of an intelligible structure again suggests perhaps, well, the nature of that fundamental reality is not just one damn thing after another, one accident after another with no pattern or order. It is deeply patterned, deeply ordered, deeply beautiful. These are values. These are things that accord well with the notion of mind or understanding. An intelligible world is very easily pictured as a world ordered by intelligence. It's not a logically deductive argument, that, but it's a deeply suggestive one. There's a very great consilience, you might say, between the idea of intelligent ordering and an intelligible universe. So materialism, in the sense of saying everything has to be in this space-time, is not just possibly false, it is definitely false if modern cosmology is true. It doesn't stop you calling yourself a naturalist in the sense of somebody who thinks there are no supernatural beings, but it does put in question or even rule out the thought that we know what matter is and we know that this universe is made out of it. We no longer know such things. In quantum physics, we have to say all that we know about the universe is how it appears to us. How it is in itself, we can indeed know mathematically. That's the difference from what might have seemed to you a reference to Immanuel Kant, right? Because it was Immanuel Kant who said, we only know the world as appearance, not as it is in itself. But for modern physicists, you actually, well, most of them anyway, think that mathematically you can know something about the world as it is in itself, but it's in a form which is totally unlike anything that we actually experience. And that 11-dimensional curved space-time, along with many other space-times in a fluctuating vacuum quantum world, that's not something that comes naturally to the person in the street. So it's not common sense. So if it's materialism, it's a long way from common sense. And is it materialism at all? To try and attack that question, I want to consider the nature of the laws of nature and what it is that they're doing. In the classical materialist view, the laws of nature lay down how little bits of matter have to behave. So you say there's a law of nature that if a certain particle exists with a certain mass and position and velocity, then in accordance with the laws of nature, it will pass into a different state with a different position, for example. The laws of nature are often thought to be universal and absolute. Now, I want to suggest to you that that idea of laws of nature is itself quite obsolete, and it doesn't reflect at all what scientists are dealing with. And I will quote, I won't just make this up, I'll quote from John Polkinghorne, who was professor of mathematical physics in Cambridge, and he says in a book that he wrote quite recently called Exploring Reality, he wrote, "We have no compelling grounds for regarding current theories in physics as being more than a form of approximation to actual physical reality as it is encountered in the limit of effective isolatability." That's the quotation. It contains three important aspects. One is approximation. Laws are approximations. Laws do not actually tell you exactly what's going to happen. Partly what he has in mind there is the uncertainty principle, according to which there's no law which tells you exactly where an electron is going to be. Partly also there's a phenomenon known in quantum physics as entanglement. Entanglement is the property in accordance with which different subatomic particles widely removed in space seem to be entangled so that what happens to one of them makes it the case that something happens to the other one. If you change the electric charge on one of them, the charge will change on the other one. And these particles may exist at different distances, which, in accordance with the theory of relativity, make it impossible for there to be any causal connection. I mean, you can't go faster than the speed of light, but these changes happen instantaneously. I can only record that quantum physicists accept the fact of entanglement. And indeed, those like David Bohm, who reject indeterminism, have to stress this property of entanglement, which they often call non-locality, even more. A non-local action is action at a distance instantaneously, which has no physical explanation. So I can't give you a physical explanation, you just say, well, it happens. But if you've got an entangled universe, that means that things may happen to objects you're investigating which you have no way of accounting for, because they may happen because of things happening even light years away in space. Right? So that John Polkinghorne says, well, the coming into being of an electron at the opposite end of the universe will have some effect on particles that you might be observing in Geneva. Now, what physicists do is they ignore any of such effects. And that means that you treat the laws as approximations to what you're observing, and you treat what you're observing as an isolated phenomenon, as though there were only this particle in this particle accelerator in Geneva, and you're just considering how it interacts with other particles, but you actually know that's false because that particle is entangled with every other particle in the universe in some way. And it's probably being affected by things you cannot experiment upon, like dark matter or dark energy. The point here is that no quantum physicist is ever now going to say we can know every causal feature, even of the physical universe. In fact, the opposite is true. We cannot ever know every causal feature, because to know every causal feature of any event in the universe, we would have to know everything about the whole universe. And no computer, no brain, no conceivable mechanism could ever contain that amount of information. If it could, we'd all be dead before we interpreted the information. We just couldn't do it. So it's impossible in principle in modern physics to give a complete causal account, even of the simplest phenomenon in the most rigorous laboratory conditions. So laws of nature are approximations. We don't say everything has to obey them. We just say, well, that's what regularly happens, and if it doesn't, we'll ignore it. We'll say, well, it would have regularly happened if we had controlled the experiment better and we got the temperature right. Something must have been wrong with the conditions. And we'll go on experimenting until it does do what we think it ought to do, and then we'll say that's the law of nature. So laws are approximations. Laws are things which govern physical things as we encounter them. And a lot depends on the sorts of experiments we do, of course. And laws govern things considered in isolation from the whole of the universe. Now, this is radical stuff. John Polkinghorne is not a radical person, I should stress. He's forced into this by the facts and the mathematics and the experimental evidence of quantum physics. So all I'm saying here is, well, we mustn't think that a materialist view, if this is the materialist view, is supported by science, the view that there are absolute and universal laws governing the behavior of physical particles, because there aren't. There are mathematically describable general principles governing the behavior of things as we perceive them with the experiments that we do when we ignore data in which we're not interested. I can quote here from a book by Paul Davies and John Gribben called The Matter Myth, in which they say the old universe of massy, hard, material particles obeying inflexible laws of nature is dead. In its place, we have a holistic, indeterministic, and open system, vibrant with potentialities and bestowed with infinite richness. Now, what they have in mind here is that modern physics talks about the universe as holistic, meaning you can only explain the behavior of the parts in terms of the behavior of the whole. It's not an atomistic view. Atoms are abstractions from reality. Werner Heisenberg even said atoms aren't real, which seems a bit extreme, but what he meant was that actually they're mathematical models for things which are much more complicated, and to understand them in detail, we would have to understand the whole universe. So that's holism. You understand the part in terms of the whole. And the universe is indeterministic. Well, that's the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, and open, that is to say, new things happen in time. The universe is emergent. Now, this picture of the universe in quantum physics sees the universe rather, as Aristotle did in some ways, as an organism. You can think of the whole of the universe as a set of potentialities for being, which progressively unfolds and becomes richer and explores different avenues of being until it reaches some sort of fulfillment, a fulfillment which was implicit in it from the very first. So it's like, in Aristotle's example, an embryo growing into an adult, or an acorn growing into an oak tree. You can think of the universe as undergoing a process that Teilhard called cosmogenesis, an unfolding of its innate potentialities. And if you do that, then you might see the two fundamental properties of human beings, namely understanding, the ability to understand the universe, and responsible, creative response to that understanding, the property of freedom, both moral and intellectual, the freedom to think logically or not just to be caused by things that happen in your brain. Those properties of understanding and creativity are the unfolding of much simpler properties of stimulus and response, which you find in the most basic elements of the material world, electrons, atoms, and so on. So you could think every particle, if you're thinking of particles, has some sort of stimulus which causes it to change, some sort of response. At a primitive level, that response is not very creative. The stimulus is certainly not conscious. And yet, a creative response and conscious understanding are natural developments of that, the unfolding of the potentialities of the system which was there from the first. So it's a much more organic growth view of the universe, and it involves the concept of information, semiotics, some call it, the concept of information as an important aspect of the physical universe. Some people these days, some physicists, think of the universe not as a mechanical system, but in fact as a computer. It's an analogy quite often used. The universe is like a computer which writes its own programs as it goes along. And, of course, that's a matter of information. A program is not just a set of physical bits. It is that, but those physical bits convey information. You know, if you have a DVD disc, on that disc there is nothing but a string of noughts and ones. That's all there is, a string of noughts and ones. That's physically what there is there. And if you say, well, that tells you everything about the DVD or the CD or whatever it is they call them these days, then you'll be missing the point. The point is that those strings of noughts and ones convey, and are meant to convey, information. They provide recipes for producing noises when they're connected up to the proper equipment. And in the same way, DNA, of course, is something which is a string of chemicals. That's quite true, that's what it is. But more importantly, it's a code which provides information to build proteins which build organic bodies. How you account for that, well, I don't know. I leave that to the biologists. But you could say to see the universe as an informational system, as carrying information for the future, not just as physical bits. That's quite a new way of seeing the universe. And it doesn't look as though it's consistent with hardline materialism. Right? To see the universe as an informational matrix is to see it as something rather different from just a lump of matter which has no designed future at all. even if the universe, as Paul Davies thinks, makes up its own design somehow, there is design in the universe. Design meaning there are codes, like the ordering of elements in DNA, which produce structures and are recipes for building those structures. So that's a very different way of seeing the universe. Now, there's one other element I would add to this story, and that element is also provided by quantum physicists, and this one is more controversial, but no one could decry it as silly, although it seems fantastic, but then everything in quantum physics does seem fantastic, so that's no objection really. Niels Bohr once said of a theory that's not fantastic enough to be true, so perhaps we shouldn't worry about it being fantastic, and that is the following. And I'll state it as Eugene Wigner has stated it, and that is that the content of consciousness is the ultimate reality, the content of consciousness. That is the opposite of saying that consciousness is a product of the material brain. What it is saying is the material brain is a product of consciousness. Now that really is, for a physicist, heresy. Or it would have been 100 years ago, because physicists are concerned with the physical, not with the conscious. And yet quite a lot of physicists are now saying you can't actually disassociate the conscious from the physical. Roger Penrose in Oxford has said, I have not talked about consciousness in my books that I've written, but I probably should have done. Penrose is quite famously a Platonist and thinks that the fundamental aspect of reality is a mathematical, timeless reality, but he inclines to think that such a reality can only be thought of as inhering in a cosmic super-intelligence. And that, of course, is a sort of consciousness. Now, Wigner is far from being alone in this view. John von Neumann is probably the best known, certainly one of the best mathematicians in quantum physics, and he has said that, in fact, all real things are contents of consciousness. Now, if you don't believe in God, that's a very problematic view. You remember Bishop Berkeley, who said that all things are contents of consciousness, and the great question, I can't remember the poem, but I wish I could, the great question is what happens to things when you're not looking at them? And Berkeley's reply, well, God is always looking at them. So everything is the content of divine consciousness. And certainly for physicists who say things are only real when they're contents of consciousness, it looks as though to make any sense at all about an objective world when we're not in it, I mean, the whole universe that existed for billions of years before we arrived in it, you have to say, well, there is some consciousness which is making that real. Now, I want to stress, of course, that not all quantum physicists believe this view. It's a minority view, I think, but the people who hold it are Nobel Prize winners, and they hold it because of some of the results of quantum physics, mainly the measurement problem that electrons only seem to be particles as a result of observation or measurement. Well, however they get to it, it's a fairly widely held view, and it means it can't be dismissed. It can't be regarded as something which is alien to physics, and that means that physics is at least conducive to an immaterialist view, that modern physics is more consistent with idealism than it is with materialism. And there I've introduced the great contrast, which I think is the main intellectual battle about the nature of the universe in our time. I have to use those words very broadly to make this make sense. Idealism, in a broad sense, is the view that mind is ultimately what reality is. That is to say, the ultimate reality has the nature of awareness, of consciousness, of intelligence, and of understanding. It's more like what we experience now than it is like a lump of wood. And an idealist will also say that that mind is a mind of supreme value, that the ultimate mind is, because a mind is something, that will choose things, that will value things, and choose them because they are valued. So it is characteristic of mind to choose things because they are good. Any intelligence will choose to do things if it's good to do them. So intelligence and value are bound up together. And value and purpose are bound up together because the purpose of an intelligent being is to produce value. So there you have the notions of intelligence and purpose and value as fundamental characteristics of reality itself. The idealist does not argue that we have a physical world here and we can infer from it, from certain features of it, that there must be some designing mind. That's not what the idealist says. The idealist says if you examine this allegedly physical world, you'll see that it wouldn't even exist unless it was a manifestation or appearance of intelligence and value and purpose, because those are the only things that are ultimately real. And I think that's where the argument lies. It's not about an inference from a solid reality. It's about the discovery that reality has never really been solid. Plato saw that, of course, long ago when he said, well, the whole of reality as we see it is simply between the real and the unreal. It's not fully real. And any world which is fully real has the nature of intelligence and value, the good. But it's interesting to see that thought occurring in much modern physics. So what I'm saying is not that all physicists have turned into Platonists, but that all physicists must accept that Platonism is on the agenda. Some form of Platonism, some form of idealism is on the agenda. And all physicists must accept that materialism in the old sense, I stress, of massy particles located in space and there being nothing else that is real, that is just as dead as a dodo. So it doesn't lead you to believe in God. Why not? I mean, the obvious thing is to say, well, that's God, this ultimate intelligible consciousness and reality, that is God. Physicists tend not to say that, and it's an interesting question, why not? One of Paul Davies's first books, he was a colleague of mine in King's College London for a while, and one of Paul Davies's first books was called God and the New Physics. And in that book he said, well, as a physicist, I am committed to belief in God, he said. That by God I mean a supreme intelligence underlying the physical universe. But, he said, this is not the God of the theologians and silly people like that. Well, he didn't say silly people like that, that's mine. He said it's not the God of theologians. The God of the physicist is much more sensible than the God of the theologians. Was he right? Well, I don't think he was, really, because I don't think there's a huge distinction between that God of the physicists, the being beyond space and time, which has perfect intelligence, mathematical beauty, a great interest in quadratic equations. Why can't that be the God of religion too? I mean, you don't always have to approach it mathematically. You can just say that's its nature. You could approach it in different ways, and people who aren't very good at quadratic equations can pray instead. But the classical God of people like Aquinas is very unlike a being who's a human person with lots of different moods, getting angry and being pleased and loving the smell of burning animals, you know, that God. And Aquinas said straightforwardly, well, of course God's not like that. I mean, these are just poetic descriptions, and some of them may be rather repugnant to us now. But they are descriptions of a being who is indeed timeless and perfect, and our relation to such a being must be really significantly different from our relation to our favorite aunt. So the God was not so different, but I think the reason that people like Paul Davies are still a bit unhappy about God is quite simply the problem of evil, the problem that this universe doesn't seem to be a universe in which goodness and love are obvious properties. If you're going to say this is a being of supreme perfection, you have the problem, how could it be responsible for a world like this? And I'll give a brief attempt at a response to that, and that is to say, well, I think you shouldn't start with the picture of God that you get from some text like the Bible. You shouldn't start there. You should be prepared to think, well, a lot of that is metaphor, and I'm going to interpret the metaphor in terms of the best philosophical understanding that I can achieve. And you mustn't worry if what you get when you think about God is not like what people like Aquinas thought. Perhaps the concepts of God do change. After all, physics in the 13th century was very different from physics now. In fact, physics in 1915 was totally different from physics now. Physics changes. So why can't ideas of God change as well if they have to? So what I'm suggesting is, why don't we construct an idea of God which looks like the idea of this great intelligence that quantum physics seems, at least to many quantum physicists, to point to. And if you did, I think you'd get a picture something like this, which is recognizable from the history of idealism in philosophy. That you would think there is a reality of intelligence and of supreme value. Any intelligent consciousness which had the power would be a being of supreme value, because that's what an intelligent consciousness would choose for itself. If you were super intelligent and you could do whatever you wanted, you would choose to be in a state that you valued more than any other. You would choose, for example, to be happy rather than sad. You would choose to understand rather than to be ignorant. You would choose to be creative rather than just to sit around doing nothing. Okay? There's certain obvious choices you would make. So it's a natural move to say a great intelligent mind, creator of the universe, would also be a reality of supreme perfection. But how does the universe arise from such a perfect being? It does not follow that any universe created by such a being would itself be perfect. That doesn't follow at all. It could be that the universe arises from that being by necessity. And indeed, that's one of the chief marks that a physicist is looking for in the universe, something that has to be the way it is, some ultimate sort of necessity. And it may be that the universe just is necessarily produced, necessarily emanates from that being, which in itself possesses all perfections, but as it were, the universe overflows from it. Plotinus certainly held that view. It's a very respectable view in the history of philosophy. And then you don't have the question, why did God create it? Wouldn't it have been better not to create it? You just say, well, there it is. That's what overflows from that being. But given that fact, you may say, that being of supreme value will intend good to come out of the existence of the universe. And perhaps you could go further and say the universe as a growing organism from potentiality to actuality, perhaps that universe necessarily carries with it the possibility of mistakes and failures and frustrations and pain. Those are necessarily part of the universe. And God, even though the universe flows from God, does not intend those things to be. God intends there to be good, which comes out of that process. And of course, great good does come out of it. There are wonderful things in this world of beauty and elegance and friendship and love. And those things are indisputably good. So if it's true that the good of the sort that we have in this world is impossible without the evils that go with it, and if God does not intend the evils but intends the good, and the evils just flow necessarily from the supreme intelligence because that's the sort of universe it is, then that might not satisfy people who want God to be completely omnipotent in the traditional sense, but it would be a way of explaining why the universe is the way it is, because that's necessarily what it has to be if the sorts of good we experience, the goods of relationship, of creativeness, which involve the possibility of breaking relationship and of destructiveness, if those goods are to exist at all. So philosophers, of course, would be quite happy to have a slightly heterodox view of God. What I'm saying is it is possible to get a consistent view of the nature of this universe and of the existence of a God, which does not carry with it paradox or contradiction. You don't have to construct schemes which carry contradictions within them. Well, that was the briefest of hints about how you might reconcile the existence of a world of frustration and suffering with the existence of a perfect God. And of course, if you added to that that this God can make fulfillment possible for every suffering being beyond death, if you make that hypothesis, which as a matter of fact most religions do, then of course it would be even more possible to reconcile, that is, to make consistent the existence of this universe with the existence of a God from whom it derives. I will end this talk by just summarizing what I think the discontents of materialism are, since the lecture was called Materialism and its Discontents, and you may be wondering exactly which discontents I have in mind. There are 7, that being a holy number. I think it's very appropriate. First of all, then, I think the first discontent of materialism, I say if you're a materialist, something you'd be discontented and unhappy about would be that you don't know what matter is. So you start off all being happy and saying, I'm definitely a materialist, I certainly believe in matter, and then you find out you don't know what matter is, and you wonder if you're believing very much anymore, really. It might come down to just a negative thought, well, at least you don't believe in God. Okay? But that's hardly a philosophy, it's a sort of prejudice. Okay? So your first discontent is we don't know what matter is anymore, it's too mysterious. You might as well say you're just a total agnostic, that would be very different. Secondly, well, the problem of consciousness looks like being completely unsolvable from a materialist point of view. That's certainly a discontent. I don't know anybody who's been convinced by Dan Dennett's very able book, Consciousness Explained. I don't know any philosopher who thinks, well, that's finished it now. Now we know, no problem left. There just is a problem left. How the consciousness and experience that we all have emerges from, as it undoubtedly does, the brain and the physical world, no one has the slightest idea. That's a reason for discontent. Thirdly, I think a reason for discontent is that it's difficult to see what basis there could be for morality, or at least a morality of a reasonably absolute or rigid or stern or demanding sort. I agree with J.L. Mackie, the philosopher who wrote a little book subtitled Inventing Ethics, when he said to talk about objective values, things which are really of value, whether or not people think they are, is just too odd if you don't believe in God, or you don't believe there's any way there could be. So the alternative is you make your moral principles up. And I think that's a great problem for a materialist, because why should you bother to make your moral principles up? I'll tell you a secret. Having been a materialist, one reason I gave it up was I couldn't see how to get any morality out of it. There were sophisticated philosophers who told me how to get morality out of it, but I didn't believe them. It was obvious to me that if I were a lump of jiggling electrons, it didn't matter much what I did as long as I could get away with it. And I thought, well, I'll be a Machiavellian, really. I'll appear to be good, so people will like and respect me, but I'll be really bad underneath. I've got away with it for most of my life. But really, I think on the whole, most of us would like to think morality is made of sterner stuff with that. And so there is a problem. Even Richard Dawkins, to whom I have posed this problem, admits there's a problem of how you get a rich, compassionate morality, which he has, from the completely pointless set of blind processes of nature, which he also believes in. A difficult problem, but I'm just talking about possible discontents. Fourthly, there's no possible sense of purpose in human life if you're a materialist. I mean, purpose is just an illusion. You can collect stamps. I mean, you can make that your purpose, or you can help the sick. I mean, it's up to you what your purpose is. But in the end, when you think, I'm just making this up, it may lose its flavor. And you may think, well, human life would be seen very differently if you thought there is an objective purpose, something for the sake of which I was actually created. There is something unique to me which I should be doing, which I am meant to be doing. It's a difference, and I think Bernard Levin, for example, is somebody who wrote, one of the last things he wrote was, he said, look, for the 1400th time, I am not a Christian, he said, but I still can't believe that my life has no purpose or significance other than the one I give to it. And that's a very deep sense which I think a materialist cannot give any importance to in the end. Fifthly, I think a materialist should be very unhappy about the fact that the universe is so intelligible and rational, because why should it be? Eugene Wigner wrote a famous article called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Why does mathematics work? Why does it apply to the universe? Why do the beautiful equations actually fit the universe if the universe doesn't have to be beautiful? It does look beautiful. Why should that be? It's just a huge mystery. You may, of course, be happy to leave it as a mystery. It's still a niggling discontent for a materialist. Sixthly, there are only 7, so don't worry. Sixthly, there's the loss of the possibility of a final explanation for the universe. Now, again, you may not want one, but I think it is a discontent that you'll never get one. A final explanation would have to be one which combined what physicists want, that is, some ultimate necessity, with what all people of goodwill want, which is some ultimate and objective value. If you could combine necessity and value, and you could say there is a reality which has to be the way it is and which is of supreme value and is the object of human longing and devotion, that would really be, if it was possible, a final explanation for the universe. Whereas if you're a materialist, there can't possibly be a final explanation. You just have to say, well, it just happens that things are the way they are. There is no explanation for it at all. There is no purpose, no consciousness, no direction. That's just the way things are. I think that's a discontent. And finally, seventhly, as the bell rings to end the lecture, there is the loss of any spiritual experience. And by a spiritual experience, I mean the possibility of love of and a sense of union with a reality of absolute goodness and beauty. And in the end, I think philosophers desire that, really, as John Calvin would say, even if they deny it with their lips, they believe it with their hearts. That the philosophical life is a life in pursuit of goodness and beauty. And the sense that you can love that and feel unity with such a reality, that is the ultimate spiritual experience. And if a materialist says that's not even a possible experience because there's no such reality, this is just a byproduct, an illusion of your electrons circling in your brains, then you've lost perhaps some of the most important experiences that exist in the human world. Well, this is not a sermon. It's just a statement about what a materialist would lose by being a materialist. And I say that because materialists often claim that they will be liberated by getting rid of religion, which is somehow harmful and bad. Well, perhaps some forms of religion we ought to be liberated from. But maybe there are lots of things about materialism that it would be good to be liberated from too. And one of them is the sense that this universe has rarely been seen by philosophers who are concerned to discover the rationality of things. It's rarely been seen to be completely without point, without purpose, without value. And maybe the philosophical quest really has been, throughout the history of Western philosophy, a quest for that which is supremely good and beautiful. And even if it turned out that we were wrong to have pursued it, it would still have been ultimately worthwhile. Thank you.